Fast forward.
Last Saturday, I was invited to go to a political demonstration about Brexit. This is not a usual occurrence for me as a participant. And I stood and I watched what people were saying and what they were doing. And there were a lot of people all standing in a park. And I have to say, at one point during the demonstration, I had this terrible thought. And this terrible thought was, what would happen if the people in the park took to the streets? And I started to think, how did we get here? Why are we here? And perhaps towards the end, a little bit more positively, is there anywhere positive we can go from here? So that's what I'm going to try and address today. You've heard so much about Brexit this week. I hope what I'm going to say now will at least leave you with something positive. I have a pad and a pen in my hand, which is the natural state of existence for me. During the demonstration in the park, we had speakers, local MPs, local notables, that sort of thing. And I was asked, don't you want to go and say something too? And I said, yes, but I'm not going to. Because I'm a journalist, I stand on the edge of the field and watch the action and report on it. I'm not a player. And I'm strangely uncomfortable, even now after all these years, with being a player. So I come to you today with my pad and my pen in my hand, hopefully to offer something above the binary divisions that you're used to having. So, both sides this week argue that they're right. Both sides get themselves into polarized positions, and we've seen it all unfolding before us all week. Who's right? Let's get back to the technical details. And let's start with something positive, because there's an element to which both sides in this fractious, polarized debate can claim that they're right. So, the Brexiteers, the hard Brexiteers, represented by the government, say they're right because they're doing what the people wanted. Because the referendum in which 52% of the country said they wanted to leave the European Union gives them the authority. And they're right, aren't they? It was a referendum, we all got the chance to vote, 52% said they wanted to leave the EU, so therefore, there is your mandate. Aha! But, so the other side say the people who don't want a hard Brexit, some people who don't even want to leave the EU, they say no. In the UK, Parliament is sovereign. What is decided in Parliament is what happens. And we saw that this week. We saw Parliament instruct the Prime Minister against his will to do something he didn't want to do. Indeed, afterwards, he said he'd die in a ditch rather than do it. Because Parliament is sovereign, and that's true. That is the little constitution we have says Parliament is sovereign. But the referendum was set up by the 2015 European Referendum Act, an act of Parliament, which said that there should be a referendum and which stated the question. Unfortunately, it didn't say what should happen afterwards. So let's start with something positive. Both sides in this debate have a measure of truth. The Brexiteers are saying they're acting on the will of the people. The other group, the people opposing them, are defending the right of Parliament. Okay? So that gives us something to start with, that they are both have a measure of truthfulness about where they are. So, let's go back a bit and look at the origins of where we are now, because I think this is really important. Last week, there was a really important anniversary, and that anniversary passed a lot of people by. Anyone tell me what that anniversary was last week? You're all very nervous. Shall I tell you? Yeah? So Sunday was the 80th anniversary of the outbreak of the Second World War. All right? Tuesday was the day that Britain declared war on Germany. And I think a lot of what we are dealing with today has its origins in the causes and conflict and aftermath of the Second World War. Firstly, in the causes. In the 1930s, Europe was in flames. People were polarized between political positions, left and right in those days, fascism and communism. And it came together in the worst conflagration that the world had ever seen, the world has ever seen. 6 years of war, millions dead, 2 nuclear bombs. Now, in this country, we developed a particular way of dealing with that because in 1940, the German army went through Europe, conquered most of Europe. The British army was driven off, out of Europe and back onto this island. And we stood alone. It's the legend and it's the truth. We stood alone, Britain, its empire and its commonwealth. Germany was all powerful. Invasion of our island seemed inevitable. The French had surrendered. The other countries had been overrun. Italy was allied with Germany. And the United States of America was yet to come into the war, and the Soviet Union had done a deal, so it wasn't involved. At that time, there came to power Churchill as our leader, who decided he was going to inspire the country through power of rhetoric and belief and defiance. And you all know the speeches, never surrender, fight them on the beaches, all that sort of thing. And if you look at that period in time, you can see a sort of defiant doggedness in the British people. We rather respect it still. It's defiant, it's dogged, it's skeptical, and unfortunately, yes, it is a little xenophobic. There is a hatred of Germany and what they were doing in that, all right? So you see it in the popular culture of the time, you see it in the interviews of the time, and people said that despite everything facing Britain, Churchill did inspire them. His rhetoric inspired a lot of them to develop this sort of bring it on kind of attitude, this defiance. So the war develops, the war gets better for the UK, and eventually the war is won. The United Nations are formed. The 1945 election is won by Labour on a ticket of positive reconstruction, and we get the National Health Service, we get the welfare state, we get a mixed economy with a role for collectivism. We get, despite everything, from the ruins of the Second World War, we get something hopeful. In international relations, we get something hopeful as well, because the powers that were, including Churchill, believed that Europe, having faced 30 years of war, couldn't face it again. Europe was in ruins. What did we do? What did we need to do to prevent Europe breaking out into war again? Well, the problem in Europe has basically been the French and the Germans fighting each other. So what was decided was, if we could think of something that united Europe rather than what divided it, which had been dominant for so long, we would be safer. And France and Germany were encouraged to get together in an economic union, which started off as iron and steel, and eventually in 1960 developed into the Treaty of Rome, the Common Market, the European Community, and the European Union. Obviously, as you all know, it starts with 6 members, then goes to 9 when we join it, and eventually finishes up at 28. And a few years ago, the European Union was given the Nobel Peace Prize to recognize the fact that perhaps the European Union had been something that had preserved peace in Europe for 70 years, okay, notwithstanding the odd conflict. So, I would suggest to you today that on both sides of the arguments that we're facing today, we have a little bit of this dogged, skeptical, bolshy, vaguely xenophobic resistance. But we also have this hopeful, positive view that if we work together, we can achieve more. That's the background. Let me leave you with 2 ideas which might offer a little bit of hope for the future. Firstly, and I've mentioned this, we all know this is true, and we need to continually remind ourselves of this. what unites us is always far greater than what divides us. Kennedy said, "We all breathe the same air." What a powerful statement that was, yeah? So, we have our Brexit debate. What unites the various parties in the Brexit debate? Now, I think one thing that upsets me about the Brexit debate is the fact that it has got so polarised, so bitter, so vitriolic, so intolerant. I don't like it. It's not good. It's not what we're used to. It's not what we want to see. And you know these big debates, we've all had arguments like this ourselves, possibly, where you actually forget about what the original argument was about. Yeah? It goes on so long and gets so deep that you can't remember whose turn was it to put the cat out, you know? Okay? And you're at daggers drawn before you know it. Think about it. What unites all parties in this big debate? And I suggest to you, it's one thing, it's a complicated thing, but I suggest to you that at the heart of it is this. What both parties want, the Brexiteers, the Remainers, everyone in the middle, is economic prosperity for the UK. That economic prosperity will give us all jobs and pensions and welfare. That economic prosperity gives us our schools, our national health services. It fills in the holes in the road, okay? We want national economic prosperity for what it can give us. So my first positive thought is, let them get together, agree that's what they want, and find that as a common piece of ground from which to start. My second suggestion is even simpler, and we seem to have lost it a little bit. Over here, we have the hard Brexiteers. Crash out of Europe on the 31st of October, or leave to a bright new future, depending on where you stand. Over here, we have the arch Remainers. We are not going to leave the European Union. We're going to lie down in front of whatever we have to lie down to stop it. Can any of you see anything between these two extremes? An awful lot of space. Most of us are probably in that space. Most of our leaders, most of the people in the House of Commons are in that space. Now, what that space requires is compromise from here and here. Rab Butler, one of the architects of the post-war consensus, described politics as the art of the possible. What our leaders need to do is compromise. Nobody is going to get everything they want from Brexit. People need to understand that. But there might be a solution somewhere in the middle that most of us could go along with, whilst acknowledging that it wasn't everything we want. Once we decide that what unites us is greater than what divides us, we can start to find compromise. So those are two ideas that I hope we can take forward. Leave you with a final hopeful thought. I started off today by saying I was concerned that it would end on the streets. And I then went on to talk about the 1930s and the Second World War. Cast your minds back. Europe was in flames. Armed gangs fought each other on the streets, all across Europe, except in one place, except here. Look at the political parties that we elected in 1931 and 1935. We stuck with the politicians we trusted, we rejected extremism, and we found these figures of extremism rather ridiculous. So, in the 1930s, it didn't end up on the streets, and I very much hope that now, today, this year, next year, it won't end up on the streets. And I think we have very good reason to be positive that it won't. Thank you.
Fast forward.